Welcome to At the Vines, the podcast that brings you inside the world of the vines, a global community of adventurers, storytellers, wine lovers, and winemakers. Through unforgettable experiences in the world's most iconic wine regions, our members connect with place, culture, and each other in ways that are both personal and profound. Each episode will introduce you to fascinating people, our members, our team, winemakers, and friends we've met along the way, and explore what inspires them to travel boldly, live fully, and craft wines that reflect their own unique stories. This episode, Brian and I are speaking with Wright Lassiter, who, along with his wife Kathy, are owners of a vineyard here in Mendoza and active participants in Vines Global, where they have made wines with us in Champagne, Priorat, and Piedmont. We also talk about how his chemistry background helps him think about creating wines. Please enjoy this conversation with Wright Lassiter. Wright Lassiter, great to see you as always after another few days of our latest adventure.
Yes.
But let's go back a little bit. What's your kind of first memorable experience with wine? And how'd you get here from there?
That's a really interesting question because the short answer is my most memorable experience with wine was probably my first experience with my father. And now, as someone who's collected wine for quite a while and consumed a lot of the world's great wines, my first experience was just the opposite. As when I was an early teenager, and my father asked me to come downstairs in our home, and he had me sitting at this bar that he had built some years earlier. And he looks at me and he goes, "Son, I know some of those guys you're probably hanging out with, particularly those older ones, are probably out drinking." And I got this sort of look on my face like, "Dad, I don't drink." He goes, No, you don't have to confess and tell me. But I want you to know what you're doing. But if you drink, I want you to drink in front of me." And that was the first time that I ever really tasted wine. He lined up little glasses in front of me and poured everything from dark liquor to clear liquor to beer. And the last thing I tasted was wine. And of all the things I tasted, I didn't like anything except red wine.
Interesting.
And I'm sure
How
the
old
red
were you?
wine, I was probably 15.
Okay.
And I'm sure the red wine that I tasted in today's standards, my standards today would be considered just above crap because my father did not spend much money on things like that. And he didn't really drink a lot. And so when he saw that I liked the red wine, his comment was, "Well, if you ever want to taste wine, we have our Sunday dinners with the family. You can have wine in front of me. But if any of these guys you're out hanging out with start talking about drinking, don't drink with them because you'll just get in trouble." And that's when I first drank wine. And so honestly, from that moment, when I realized that I liked wine, and periodically I would on Sunday dinners with family have a little bit of red wine, I sort of said to myself at that point that when I got older and had some money that I wanted to learn more about wine.
Interesting.
But it wasn't until probably 10 years later that I began doing it. And so at that point, my first memorable experience was joining something called the International Wine Cellars just out of college. And I would get a couple bottles of wine a month and tasting notes. And I just read them like I was studying for a test. And that's really how I got into wine.
Interesting.
As an
Well, it's
adult.
funny. Even today, you're much more of a wine drinker than an alcohol drinker. I mean, you've got some, and every once in a while we'll try something. But your go-to is still wine.
It is. I have if you come to my house, you might not believe that because I have a lot of alcohol. But it's because
You're
of friends.
a good host. You're a good host.
And so if I know you like X, then I'll have it in the house for you to drink. And I won't drink it unless that person comes because I don't generally drink a lot of alcohol.
Yeah. I do appreciate the cold beers waiting for me when I get to the Lassiter home.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
What opinion do you have about wine that most or many people would disagree with?
That's a really interesting question. So I guess I started out early on with a bias towards old world wines before I knew anything about old world versus new world. And, having a house in California currently and living in California for a good portion of my adult life, I was never a big fan of California wines. As a matter of fact, when I first began drinking wines and started learning more and getting familiar, I only drank mostly Italian and Spanish wines.
Interesting. So it wasn't that they were big necessarily, because so many of the wines you like from Italy, France, and Spain are huge wines. So it wasn't that, which is what normally kind of puts people off of
it was really all about winemaking style.
Mm-hmm.
And so, at a time when I didn't really understand the characteristics of old world wines and leather and earth and all the things that oftentimes characterize wines from Europe, what I enjoyed, I just enjoyed that flavor profile. And so when when Kathy and I first moved to California, and I was telling people I was moving, got all excited. Oh, you're a wine guy. You're moving to California. And I said, I don't really like California wine. And so to this day, while we have California wine in our cellar, it's not necessarily my preference. Now, for a lot of people that I spend time with, California is one of the things that they love a lot. And living in California, I meet a lot of people that when they come over, they want to drink something from California. And that's not the first thing I'm going to pull out for you. I'm going to pull out something from France or Spain or Italy far before I'll pull out something from California, because I like the style better of in other countries.
It's interesting. I think a lot of our members and a lot of the people we've come across with in over the last years is that people kind of seem like Napa or everywhere else. I mean, there are people that just won't drink anything that isn't Napa, especially at the high end. And then, but most people that like wines from around the world, they're like, I'll drink one. I can appreciate it. And it's part of it. It's not so much that people are afraid to spend the money, but I think part of it is it's just like, part of the problem, the reality is it's hard to get a really good California wine for less than $200 or $300. And and no matter how much money you have, it's still kind of like, well, I could get twice as good a wine in a lot of cases. There's amazing Napa wines and I enjoy them, but it's interesting how that's kind of a trend, I think.
I don't mind spending money for good wine, but I always like value.
Mm-hmm.
And so I oftentimes feel like a $200 or $300 bottle Napa wine actually is mediocre, but a $200 bottle of Spanish wine
or
Argentina or Argentinian wine is amazing. And so it's a little bit of that. And I get bored of hype, and there's a lot of hype in Napa. I mean, honestly, when people come visit us in California, and I'm also a bit of a contrarian by nature. So I would frankly rather take someone to Livermore Valley and have them experience wines there, when most folks have never heard of Livermore Valley and they're like, we're going where? I'm like, we're going 45 minutes, hour outside of San Francisco, but we're going east. We're not going north. Or now today, thanks to the vines, I'd rather take a road trip to Paso Robles.
Yeah.
And again,
with Juan and Eric and the boys.
Nothing wrong with Napa and Sonoma. And again, there's some great wines and there's some really cool wineries and some cool people there. And there's great food there. But if I'm going to take folks from outside someplace, it's only Napa if they've never been or that's what's interesting to them. So
Interesting. So you've made a significant amount of wine with us over the last few years. Are there any, I know you have a science background, you've got a sports background, you've got a business background. You're into art. Are there anything from any of those fields that influences your winemaking, your approach to winemaking?
Well, it's interesting. It is true that I have a science background and a degree in chemistry, which I don't use, and I haven't really used professionally throughout most of my life. But so I would say that the notion of blending things together to make something new, different, is certainly one of the things that appeals me to the whole winemaking process. I think that from a sports perspective, I was always wildly competitive. Oftentimes I'd say I'm more competitive with myself than with someone outside of myself. And so when I think about winemaking, it's sort of the competition is not, I want to make a wine that's better than someone else, but it's like, how do you really make the best? And then I guess I would say, winemaking is this very interesting journey. And the only journey like winemaking that I've been on is, as a child, I was a stamp collector. And I was fascinated with the exploration. I wasn't really big on history per se, but I was wildly interested in the culture that stamps represented and why a country chose X to be a stamp of relevance and reference. And in my mind, winemaking is a lot like that, because what I've always enjoyed the most is wine that expresses where that grape was grown and the culture that vineyard exists in. And so it's that
the food and the people and all of that.
Yeah. And so to some extent, that's why I like wines outside of Napa Valley. And what I really love about the vines is working with the winemaking team it's really all about how do you express the greatest potential of those grapes that came from this patch of earth. It's not about we're so smart, let's take our winemaking wizardry to create something that is less than natural. But it's about what is the best possible expression of those little blueberries that grow on these vines. And honestly, I would say that what's clearly well beyond what I ever expected when we bought a small vineyard in Mendoza, I never thought about making variety of wines in other places. And frankly, at the time that we bought, I didn't fully appreciate how many varietals were being planted in the vines, and frankly, how many opportunities you have to explore beyond what you might even have planted in your vineyard. And so it's a wonderful journey that doesn't have a finish line.
Nice. Other than Brian's charm and sales finesse, what kind of drew you to the vines? What got you started with us?
Well, I'm a big believer that life is this series of interconnected journeys. And in most cases, if you're willing to allow yourself to be on the path, you end up exactly where you're supposed to be, even when you don't have any idea about where you're supposed to be. And so, the vines, I would call it accidental in one sense, because I never sought to want to be a winemaker, but not accidental because clearly this was a path that I was supposed to be on, starting back from that conversation with my dad at 15. Mm-hmm. And, I got here because I was chatting in 2017. I had a chief strategy officer, and he and I were chatting just about business. And at the end of the meeting, he goes, "Oh, hey, there's this thing that I've been wanting to mention to you." And I said, "Oh, yeah, what is it?" And he goes, "Well, I'll be back." And he goes to his office, comes back. He goes, "Some friends of ours are thinking about investing in a vineyard in Mendoza, and they sent it to us asking if we might want to do something with them. And it's kind of a bit above our heads. Like my wife and I could never wrap our minds around something like that. But you're really into wine, so you might be interested. And so here, take a look at it." And so he gives it to me, and I say, "Oh, thanks," and I'll take a look at it. And I initially hand it to my assistant and say, make a file and, put it in a tickler so that I don't forget about it. And what did I do? Forgot about it. So it was in the file. And a few months later, at the end of the year, we were cleaning out our files as we used to do every year. And she goes, "Hey, there's this thing, this tickler file. Was I supposed to call and make an appointment?" And I said, "What is it?" And she shows it to me, and it says it's about the vines. And so I take it home that weekend, and I take a look at it, and I go out to the internet, and I do a little search, and I see Brian's name on it. So I reach out, and we started a conversation. And it was really fascinating because I thought it was interesting. I'm generally less risk averse than my wife. And so I was like, this sounds like really fascinating. And I'm like, what would Kathy think about this? And it was also a time when we were planning for our 25th wedding anniversary. And we had decided we weren't going to buy presents for each other. Kathy's idea, she goes, "Hey, we have enough stuff. Like, let's just travel and enjoy our family. Let's do a family trip, and let's do a trip with ourselves, and let's not buy gifts for the 25th wedding anniversary." And after talking to Brian once and actually a couple of times and getting a bit more interested, I started thinking this might be cool. And so I said to Kathy one day, "Hey, honey, how about we buy a vineyard to celebrate our 25th wedding anniversary?" And she looks at me like, what? A vineyard? What? A vineyard? Why would we buy a vineyard? I thought we weren't going to buy stuff. And I said, "Well, a vineyard's not stuff." And she goes, "Well, where did that come from?" And I said, "Listen, we're going to create this little company called Lassiter Family Vineyards. We'll make wines. We'll dedicate them to members of the family. And we'll do that to celebrate our 25th wedding anniversary. And we'll make wines for as long as we can. And then we'll give it to our daughter, Lauren, and let Lauren to figure out how she can take it forward." And she's like, "Well, that's an interesting, cool idea that I could never say no to, but I'm still trying to figure out why we'd buy a vineyard." And she goes, "Where is it?"
Well, that's Napa? Better than the response you might have expected, which was, "Have you lost your damn mind?"
Yeah, well, and I'm kind of the idea part of the couple too at times. And so she goes, "Okay, well, tell me more." So I tell her a little more, and from conversations that Brian and I had. And then she goes, "Well, where is it?" And I said, "Oh, well, it's in Argentina." And so then she's like, "What? Argentina? Well, why wouldn't we buy it in Napa?" And again, Kathy I'm value oriented, but I don't have sticker shock about spending money. Like my view is you make money, you spend on stuff you want to spend it on. And I'm not interested. As long as I feel like I'm getting good value, then I don't really have a reaction to things. Kathy's more of the very frugal, kind of person. And so she's like, well, it seems like that'd be wow, that's too far away. And I said, honey, well, let's think about this. I said, the average price of an acre in Napa versus the average price of an acre in Argentina. And she goes, oh, well, Argentina sounds like a really good idea. Yeah, that sounds like a great idea if we're going to do this. And, honestly, what sold it was I have a bit of an impatient nature.
Oh.
And I was talking to Brian as he was talking about, buying a plot that hadn't been planted and how long it takes. And I was like, Brian, I'm not interested in buying dirt and waiting 4 years. And he goes, well, I think I have some ideas. And so, Brian always is like a half step in front of you with ideas. And so he, we get off the phone and then he sends me a text. Hey, can you get on a call with our consulting winemaker, Santiago Achafal? And I was like, yeah. Well, can you do a video call? I was like, yeah, what are we going to talk about? He goes, well, I think Santiago might be interested in selling one of his plots. It's been planted since 2007 and he's been making wine since. And I sort of thought, okay, this is supposed to happen. I mean, like it's way too, the consulting winemaker, the guy who started this
who got
process
first pick.
with Mike. I'm like, and so when I told Kathy that, she was like, oh, great. So when do we go see it? And I said, honey, we're not going to see it. She goes, what do you mean? I said, well, I'm just going to buy it. I said, so there's some paperwork. And so, I'm going to, we'll have our attorney look at it. We're just going to buy it. She goes, we're not going to go down and see the vineyard? And I said, well, yeah, okay, let's go. And I said, great. I said, make a list of things we're going to look at and like what our criteria will be. Because when we buy like houses, like we have this very elaborate evaluation matrix that we fill out and we score every property and we do it independently so we can see. And I said, so honey, just write down all the criteria so I can make the evaluation matrix. And oftentimes I say things to my wife, knowing what the answer will be. And so she looks at me and she goes, well, I don't know what we'd look at. And I said, me either. As a matter of fact, I said, I've read all the soil sample reports. I've read like all the background that I could read. There's really nothing to look at. I said, it's vines amongst a bunch of other vines. Nothing to look at. I said, my view is either we're going to do it or we're not going to do it. And she goes, so you feel good about it? I said, I feel great about it. I said, I don't know if you're making wine, but we're going to figure it out. So that's how we got into it. Yeah.
It's been a really hell of a virgin.
6 years.
Yeah.
It's been 6 years now.
But it's interesting. So you started here in Mendoza and then you were one of a small group of people that Brian and Duffy and I put together to expand beyond Mendoza and to go global, as it were. And we're really grateful for that. And our first trip, of course, to Montalcino together, that you were there for about 40 hours on your birthday. And it was a really special moment for all of us. And we're very thankful for helping us get this global thing going. But is there an international standout moment or trip that kind of encapsulates your experience with the vines beyond Mendoza?
Well, you highlighted Montalcino, and for a lot of things in life, the first time you encounter something oftentimes can be most memorable. And, I would say that while we've absolutely enjoyed our now 4 trips to Urville, France for champagne making, and we've absolutely enjoyed our 3 trips to Priorat to make wine with Dominic. I think the first trip to Montalcino was probably the most memorable for a couple of reasons. Number one, as you mentioned, I didn't have a lot of time. It was in between a board meeting and a speaking engagement or something. So I had just, 2 days, spread over 3 to be there. 1, 2, I was a big fan of Casanova de Neri wine, and the opportunity to just sort of to buddy it up with Giacomo Neri in his vineyard, in their blending room, in their tank room, in their barrel room was really, really special.
Too bad about the vintage, though. It was only that 2016. So, it was,
And it gives us access to the fruit from 2016 and vineyards, the 2 vineyards that, are iconic, that are form the basis of some of his best wine, but then a vineyard that no one outside his inner circle had ever tasted. The fact that I land and I get a 3-liter bottle of his best wine signed by Giacomo telling me happy birthday, which, I wasn't expecting. So I think that whole experience was great. And so the fact that we got to be sort of the pioneers to try our first travel with Vines Global was outstanding. So, yeah, so I would say that that's most memorable by far because it was the first. And none of us knew fully what to expect. I mean, you guys had done prospecting, and so you had a better sense. But the few of us that went didn't know what to expect, and spend time with the Sesti family, and to have the patriarch of the family and his boys from the town sing to us, and I mean, it was just it's really hard to replicate those moments.
Yeah, that was extraordinary. I remember after that, we went back a year and a half or 2 years later after the wines were made. And we went over back to see Giacomo, and because Giacomo's, as I know you know, right, but a lot of people listening might not know, is that he really doesn't blend wines. Mm-hmm. His wines are pure from single vineyards, Tenuta Nuova, Cerro Alto, et cetera. Right. And so even the concept of blending is a little bit foreign to him. Right. And to go back, and we went back after the wines were ready, and we tasted them, and just watching him taste that wine that was blended, and we're all, of course, just like, oh God, is he gonna hate it or whatever? And he tasted, he swirls around, and he's got kind of a serious look on his face, and he kind of turns around and just breaks into a big smile. And it was pretty cool for us to be able to impress Giacomo a little bit was pretty great.
You know those trips where you just feel like you're checking boxes? At the Vines, it's completely different. You're out in the vineyards, blending your own wine with amazing winemakers, discovering hidden places, and sharing these incredible dinners with people who feel like old friends. It's real, it's hands-on, and it's unforgettable. Come hang out with us. Check us out at The Vines Winemakers on Instagram.
We've had a lot of wonderful adventures with Wright and Kathy over the last 6 years. Anything strike out to you?
I mentioned to Michael earlier that trip, you and Kathy was really inspirational to me because you made it work in such a short time. And there have been times where, I'm looking at travel time and, do I want to go to this city for this dinner or this experience? And I always go back to that and think, these folks, they knew us, but they didn't really know. We weren't as close friends as we are now. And came all the way over for 30 hours. The travel time was more than the time you were in Italy. Mm-hmm. And that was inspirational to me for sure.
Yeah. So to change gears a little bit, you all put a lot of thought into your wine labels. Mm. Can you walk us through a little bit of the creative process or maybe one of your favorite labels that you've come up with and how you developed it?
I would just say that for Vines owners and for global members, that part of this process is actually maybe as rewarding as the actual winemaking. And people likely don't think about that. But I think particularly because, a lot of us call our ventures, legacies after our names, our surnames, right? And for some, it probably means different things. For us, because we really see this as a bit of a family legacy, every time we do a label, we're trying to sort of think about, so what represents, all those who came before us and what might represent those who come after us, and how do we create something that makes a statement? And our first label, in many ways, we put probably maybe the most time and effort into because we had never done it before and we didn't want to screw it up. And we really wanted it to be a lasting brand for our wines. And so we came with the name Vinyo, MVINYO, for our Argentine brand. And it really resulted from us, like a lot of families, doing a bit of Ancestry.com and trying to figure out where your roots are from and that kind of thing. And when we did that and realized that, not unsurprisingly for us, we had a lot of ancestral DNA from various parts of Africa, I began trying to find a word that would represent that. And the name of our label is a Swahili word for wine. And so we sort of thought that was sort of cool because it was sort of a double entendre on vino, the Spanish word for wine, and vino spelled differently, the Swahili word for wine. So that we thought was really cool as a sort of an overarching brand. And so then as we started thinking about label, and because our first wine was named in honor of our daughter for Lola's Cuvée, we were talking to her about it. And I think at some point she was putting on either a swimsuit to go get in the pool or putting on, as young people do, a shirt that fathers think is too revealing or something. And I noticed as she turned around the tattoo she had, at that point she had one tattoo and it's in the center of her back. And I remember when she wanted to get a tattoo and it was a big family conversation because one of us was in favor and one of us wasn't. But we ended up relenting when she was asking us about this because of what she wanted to do, which was to put two West African symbols on her back, one which sort of meant blessed in shorthand and one which meant child of the heavens. And we saw that tattoo and I said, honey, if we're going to use the Swahili word for wine, we ought to take these two African symbols and make that like our label for our wine. And so I took a picture of her tattoo on her back and I went to my company and grabbed one of our graphic designers and I said, hey, can you make me like an icon for a label? And she goes, what kind of label? What's the product? And so I started telling her and I paid her off the clock of, healthcare work to figure it out and to give me something that I could then send to the vines. So our first label was really inspirational because it was focused on, a bit of family heritage with the name Vino, the brand icon being our daughter's tattoo, which integrated well with this African name. And then we put a little slogan on it that said, without faith, one cannot thrive because faith is an important part of our family dynamic. And so that label probably is the most meaningful of all the labels. But then what we found is that every time we approach a new wine, it's a new discovery around, okay, so how do you get a label that actually expresses the partnership we have with the winemaker in this country, in this region, and what we think would pay homage to what we're trying to do. And as you mentioned previously, working with Giacomo Neri, the label that we came up with for our Brunello with him was also really, really special, and working with the designer there, because it really takes into consideration our love of art and particularly abstraction. And both wine and art, in my mind, are two mediums that allow one to use their imagination to construct whatever it means to them. Mm-hmm. And so our view is that wine allows you to interpret it the way you want. I mean, there are some things that you would expect as you talk about a Brunello, or as you talk about a Barolo, or a Napa Cab, or whatever the case may be. But this notion of where does the wine take you when you taste it, and then where does the label take you? And so what we try to do is sort of create a journey both with the wine, what's inside the bottle and what's outside the bottle.
Very cool. So you all make a significant amount of wine with us in Mendoza and around the world. Some of our new members are afraid of having too much wine. That clearly must not be an issue. What do you do with your wine?
Well, I would just tell new owners just to get over the notion of too much wine, because the answer is there's never too much wine. There's always something to do with your wine. And so for us, we commercialize a little bit, but that was never the primary objective. It actually wasn't the objective at all when we first did this. It was really make wine that we like, honor family, give it to friends and family, and donate it to charities. It really wasn't, oh, let's sell it at all. And then I will say that the vines is a gravitational force that pulls you into it. And so we never thought that we'd be making four different wines in Mendoza. We certainly never thought we'd be making wines all across the world like we're doing now. So, we commercialize an amount of it. We share a lot of it with friends and family. We donate it to lots of places. Now, the more people are getting to know what we're doing, we get requests pretty regularly for, hey, we're doing this, we're doing that. Would you mind donating a case of wine to this, a case of wine to support this cause? And so we do a lot of that. I give it to my executives. Mm-hmm. We just got our first bottling of champagne. And so I hosted our team last month. And after dinner at my house, they all got to take champagne home with them.
It's shockingly not that difficult to get rid of wine once you put your mind to it.
It really isn't. I mean,
if somebody wants to try your wine, I know you've got your Instagram is Lassiter Vines. Do you have a website also? What's the best way to get in touch with you if somebody wants to try the wines?
Yeah, so people message us a lot on Instagram, which is an easy way to do it. We also have a website, just lassitervines.com, and that's the way to get to our online direct-to-consumer portal, where you can buy most of our wines.
Any wine that you'd say, all right, this is a start. If you want to get to know kind of the Lassiter Vines style of wine, start with this one?
Well, I love our Malbecs. And so, as we just finished the Gold Wine Summit, and we had an exercise earlier today of you get a card that describes a consumer, and you're trying to make a wine for that consumer. I'd say that if you're just getting started with wine, start with our Vino premium wine. It's easy to drink. It's very approachable. The tannins are soft and integrated and resolved, and it's not very expensive. It's $28 a bottle. And so I'd say, start there. If you still want to stay in Malbec, you want something a little more complex, our Dosa Spiritus, which is our Bordeaux blend, but Malbec driven, has been wildly much better than I ever thought it could ever be. And then I would just say that, our Carignan Grenache blends from Priorat, Spain are really special to us.
Yeah.
And Dominic Huber is such a fun partner, and he does such great wines, and have an opportunity to make those kinds of wines in a place like Priorat, which seems to be like, it's like Paso Robles in my mind, or it's like maybe Mendoza 20 years ago. I don't know where the rules, there are rules, but there are a lot of people that are doing things outside the rules. And that's one of the reasons why we like Dominic, because he's a contrarian.
There are two kinds of people. People who like wine and people who make their own wine in the middle of a vineyard in Argentina while planning their next trip to South Africa or New Zealand or Champagne. If you're the second kind or want to be, check out The Vines. We design wild, delicious, and slightly addictive wine adventures all over the world. Follow @The Vines Winemakers on Instagram. You'll get it.
Yeah, and to that point, Dominique does not have the typical Priorat 15% alcohol. They're much more elegant, transparent. Now he's not using any oak at all. It's really and it's a nice contrast to the wines from Mendoza as well.
Yes.
So in addition to the wines you make, you have a very nicely curated cellar and collection of wine that Brian and I have both been the benefactors of your and Kathy's deep generosity. But how do you decide what to open on a special occasion? Is there anything in particular, or is it just like, all right, tonight I'm feeling like we got to go for Spain, or I'm cooking. I know you're a chef and can cook a lot as well. But like when you're heading down to the cellar, what are you thinking about? Or do you know? Do you know, like, if you know you're having dinner at home, at 10 o'clock in the morning, you already know what you're opening up.
Yeah. So, honestly, I would say, no, rarely at 10 in the morning do I know what I'm going to open at night. I'm probably a bit more spontaneous. It's a lot about who's there, what mood we're in. And, if we're cooking at home or ordering in, like what are we cooking, and what do we think is going to go with it best? And sometimes actually it's even more organic. It is, I'll ask Kathy, hey, if it's just the two of us, hey, you have a taste for something? And she's like, no, not really. And she's like, what about you? I'm like, no, I'm just going to walk down the cellar and just walk around, and something is going to speak to me, and we'll pull it. And that's what we're going to do. And so we try not to have a ton of rules. Like, if we're having fish, we don't have to always have a white wine just because we're having fish. And so it just kind of depends. Actually my wine palate is a little bit like my cooking palate, where oftentimes I have no idea what I'm going to do until I start. Or I'll look up in the morning and say, well, geez, what do we want to do? And then you'll go to the freezer or you go to the market, and so, okay, what's speaking to you? And you go with that. And then it's like, all right, well, what kind of wine do you want to do? So, and sometimes we also try to push ourselves around wine making and around wine drinking with food. Oftentimes it is a lot too, if people are over with us, okay, so who's coming? Like, what are their tastes? And then, we have some friends that are really high-end wine drinkers and collectors like us. And so then it's about, let's find something really special.
Yeah. And something special probably that they haven't had yet. Something that's going to surprise them a little bit.
The most fun thing for me is like the dinner we hosted, back in June with Santiago and you and others. And people bring in wines, which is really, really cool. And then you say, well, what do you have that would be really interesting and unique that maybe no one's ever had that you can share? And so for me, I always believe that when you bring out something, it's not about bragging about what's in your cellar. It's about the whole point of the cellar is sharing it with others. people say, well, geez, how much is your cellar worth? How much do you spend on wine? And I say, yeah, I track the value of my cellar and all that sort of stuff. I track it mostly so that I can tell my insurance folks like what's the appropriate rider on my wine rider. So I in the event there was something catastrophic, but it's not because I'm ever going to sell it or because I really care about the value from the ego perspective.
Right. You talk a lot about sharing, and you two are the greatest hosts I think I've ever met. Is that family? Is that like just when growing up? I mean, where does that come from for you guys? Because it really, I mean, you are, for those that don't know, high-powered executive. You travel, I don't know, probably 200 days a year. You're busy all the time. But when you get home, a lot of people would say, I've been traveling for 2 weeks. I'm staying home, not doing anything. You guys are having a dinner party.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that, when you get to a certain point in life, you sort of recognize that when you've had, some measure of success and you're blessed in a lot of ways, that the whole point of that really isn't to just sit around your kingdom and beat your chest around how wonderful, the kingdom is. It's really about sharing with others. And so I think, some of that is just family values is sort of what, parents sort of instilled in you. And my father came from a very large family, and he was the oldest of 12. Mm. And while we gathered, Christmas when we were really young was the time when we all gathered together. So what I recall are these scenes of my grandparents' home where there's people everywhere, right? It's not organized. It's just kind of organic. And the people in the family room, and there are people in the dining room, and there are people in the kitchen, and people just in the hall. And there's just like this humanity everywhere. And I remember my grandmother was just really it was always about food. My grandfather wasn't Baptist minister, so he didn't really drink much at all. And my grandmother didn't drink. So it definitely wasn't about alcohol for them. And my parents weren't. My father wasn't big at drinking. My mom liked cocktails a lot. Didn't really drink a lot of wine. But I remember growing up, too, in the family that there was always events. My parents were members of a number of social and professional organizations, whether it's fraternities or other kinds of professional organizations. And so there's always gatherings of people. Yeah. And they would always take us to these gatherings, even as young kids. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of the environment that I grew up in. And so to some extent, I will say that I am, although most folks don't really understand this, I am more of an introvert than extrovert, meaning that I derive my energy when I can just shut down and turn on some jazz and just have peace. But I enjoy the energy of people around and the whole notion of entertaining and sharing. I love to cook, and so I love to cook for others. Cooking for yourself is boring. Yeah. Cooking for 8 or 10 or 12 or 20 people is interesting, especially if it's things that you can explore. And so you have the other belief that, you have far more than you can ever consume yourself. And so the whole point of having stuff, frankly, is for others to be able to experience it.
Is there a bottle that you've been looking for that you just haven't, like if there's one bottle you'd add to your cellars or anything, like, you got a white whale out there somewhere?
I mean, this may sound a bit arrogant. I don't mean it that way, but not really, because I've worked really hard in a relatively short period of time. Like when I talk to people who are wine collectors, a lot of folks have been collecting wine for decades. And I didn't have that luxury because I really didn't begin collecting wine. It was seriously less than 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. And, I told you a story that, when I decided I want to get serious about collecting wines, I had a couple hundred bottles in my collection. And that was at the end of 2014. And so that was less than 10 years ago. Yep. And now we, have over 6,000 bottles in our cellar. And so I was very purposeful. I was very fortunate that I had a few buyers from importers on both coasts that I was able to be introduced to. And I just said to them, I want to build a collection of X. Help me. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how to do it myself. And so when I first began in 2014, I said to the guy in California, I want to build an amazing Bordeaux collection. Where do I start? And so he says, oh, well, how about if we start with the first growths? And I said, okay. And he said, well, what do you have in your cellar today? And I said, nothing. And he said, okay, well, here's what I would suggest that we start with. And I said, all right, well, give me some offers for that. And he goes, well, every time I get an offer of those, I'm going to send it to you. And then we'll just start building. And so then we started with, second growths and third growths, and then the things that are really special but aren't classified that way. And so I think when I think about special bottles, so like I think about the 1982 vintage in Bordeaux, and I have the luxury of having all of the first growths and second growths and then other things that I'm really interested in. Like I love Lynch Bage, and while it's considered a fifth growth, but I'm a big fan of Lynch Bage. And so I've probably got a 20-year vertical of Lynch Bage in the cellar. I've got, I've not drank a lot of this, but I've got, probably a dozen bottles of Chateau Petrus of various vintages. And so I think about 61, which is my wife's birth year. And at some point we'll drink a 61 Petrus to celebrate her birthday. Or I think about, Le Pen or Fleur. And so I don't know that there's anything that I can speak to. We got weird stuff. Like I've got port from 100 years before I was born. It's kind of just because I was collecting a lot of port, and my birth year, 63, is a crappy wine year.
Yeah, I'm 65. It's also
but it's
terrible.
An amazing port year. So I've got all the major ports from that time period at 63 and 61, and some older. And I had a guy, an importer, who said, "Hey, I know you're collecting port and you like, special birth years. How about 100 years before you were born?" And I said, 1863? He says, "Yeah." And he says, "I have one bottle of it and I reserved it for you." And so I was also one where I would say to these guys, "Here's the kinds of things I'm looking for. You find something, call me." And the first thing I won't ask you is how much does it cost. I'll ask you, tell me about provenance. Where is it coming from, and is it a really, good bottle, and will it be worth it? And I've never opened a bottle that's been horrible like that. Like 2 weeks ago, we just opened a 1947 Chambon Musigny Burgundy that there's no way that everyone who drank it, no one thought it was 75 years old. Yeah. People were like, "Okay, this is like from the 80s. I'm like, "No, it's 47. And so I've got a bunch of stuff from the 40s and 50s. And, I don't buy cases upon cases of wine, but I'll buy a few bottles for like drink today, tomorrow, and in the future kind of thing. And
Very cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, speaking of drinking wine, we've got Mariana and the team putting together a tasting. I think we've got 16 wines. How many wines? So you've been this week at Wine Pro, our kind of intense boot camp, wine education boot camp. And you're obviously a very knowledgeable wine person. So did you learn something this week? Would you recommend it to other folks? And how many wines do you think you've had so far in the last 4 days?
So Wine Boot Camp is so appropriate for this Vines Pro Summit. I think it's fair to say that the last 4 days, we're probably very close to, if not over, 60 different wines.
Wow.
Worth it unequivocally.
But even for somebody who's knowledgeable, because I think a lot of people say, "Oh, I know a lot about wine."
So we brought another couple down with us, the person who really got me into wines, who I think in many ways, probably is more knowledgeable than I am. And we both commented how much we learned, both in general about wine, winemaking process, terroir, et cetera, but also things that will help us as we make wine in the future.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I said to Mariana, this class was amazing. I frankly can't imagine what you could do to make it better. Now, it is for someone who really wants to go deep.
But do you need to be an expert? I mean,
absolutely not.
No.
As a matter of fact, you don't need to be an expert. What you really need is an inquisitive nature.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to be willing to devote the mental energy to 3 intense days.
You guys are studying. I mean, I've seen the notebooks just like getting filled up.
It is, you have to be willing to do that. And not everyone is. Like, not everyone has the mental stamina to want to do that like all day long. And what Mariana has said, which I completely agree, which is in some ways she's just touching scratching the surface on some things. Like I said to her, "Mariana, I would love to have a deeper dive lesson on wine chemistry." Mm-hmm. And some of that's because of my background and with a chemistry degree. But I think it would help me even more understand, particularly as when you're trying to make wine, because you're making wine partly for yourself. But the short answer is more people will drink our wine than my wife and I. And so you're really making it for others, and you're making it for their enjoyment. And so, yes, you want it to be something that you enjoy, but you want it to be something that others enjoy, and not from a commercial perspective, but just because you're going to share it more widely than not. And so I would highly recommend it. I think that this notion of having a wine summit and this being the first offering of, I'm going to say it out loud, Brian, so I'm going to give Brian of Vines University is really cool. One of the things that we've talked about is this was an amazing session, and having it here in Argentina actually made it more challenging for us than it might have been if you were doing it someplace else, because the Argentinian expression of some of the varietals is different than you might be used to. And so when you think about Merlot on the right bank of Bordeaux versus Merlot in Mendoza, it has different characterization. Our last exercise today was to be given a card with a description of a consumer that you have to make a wine for. And Mariana gave us a dozen plus varietals with different winemaking styles, from barrel fermented to no oak. And you have to read the description of the consumer you're making a wine for and then try to replicate it. And so I got given a card to make a wine for a passionate wine drinker who enjoyed wines from well-known regions, older, mature, earthier wines. And so I tried to replicate, and I called it, you had to label your bottle, so I called it Chateau Cheval Wright. So I tried to replicate Cheval Blanc from here, a wine that normally is mostly Cab Franc and Merlot. And I added a little bit of barrel first use Petit Bordeaux to give a little more power. And I used more Cab Franc than Merlot because of the nature of those varietals in Argentina. But it was sort of a fascinating exercise. And Cheval Blanc is one of my favorite right bank Bordeaux wines from Pomerol. And so this notion of, we spent the last 3+ days learning about wine, going deep into everything we can. Now we have to try to create a wine that fits this consumer, and then see if the others around the table believe that we actually got it right. It was a very fascinating exercise. Not sure that I could have done that, or certainly I did it better today than I could have done Thursday when I arrived. And so,
or much less 2 years ago or 3 years ago.
Yes, certainly.
Well, that's a great way to finish. We could go on for hours, and we will do another one on this because we've got lots of ground to cover. But I want to say thank you for spending this time. But more importantly, I really appreciate you and Kathy. Brian and we're very fortunate to have the vines, to drink wines from around the world. But by far the greatest blessing of my life, and I'm sure the answer is true for Brian, is just the friendships that we've developed. I mean, we are no longer, client and business. We're family, and there's nothing better than that. So really appreciate you and Kathy, and let's go drink some more wine.
Let's go drink some more wine. Thank you, Michael. Thanks, Brian.
All right.